Thank everyone for being here, and thank Kenneth Lumpkin for putting this event together. One of Dr. Martin Luther King's allies, Kevin Kaplan, said, "It's bad enough to be blind, but it's worse to have eyes and not see." And I think it's apropos for today, and that we need to have our eyes wide open and see the things that are going on to erode all of the conditions that Dr. King fought and stood for. Disparities in our education, workforce, and so forth. Injustices, mass incarceration, and things of that nature.
Well, good morning. Welcome back to Talking Racine. I'm Dr. Ken Jorgen, your host, and we have a special guest this morning, and Mr. Ken Lumpkin, who is a guest today, who's usually a regular panelist, and Mr. Donnie Snow. Donnie Snow worked for the City of Racine for a long time, 33 years. You were chairman of the Parks and Recreation or director,
yes,
for 15 years, and now you're retired. You liking it?
I am. I'm enjoying it, doing different things now. Attempting to learn how to play a musical instrument is one of the things.
Oh, well, all right.
Mention a few.
Good, good. Well, the reason we wanted to have you guys on today was because a week ago today was the celebration of Martin Luther King Day, and that was down at the memorial down on Milwaukee Avenue and State Street. And that's something, the laying of the wreath is something that you instituted like 15 years ago.
Yes.
And this year you served as kind of the master of ceremonies for that event.
I guess you can call it that.
Yeah, well, you had the microphone more than anyone else.
I did, yes.
But yes, we want to have you guys in and talk about that a little bit. And well, another reason that we have you guys on in particular is that you are both from Alabama.
Yes.
Yes.
You were Montgomery.
I'm from Montgomery.
And you were from Selma.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the beginning and end point of the march? They went across the
march from Selma to Montgomery.
Yeah.
Across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Now,
in fact, whenever we would have the opportunity to go to town, which we call Selma the town.
Well, yeah, you were raised outside of town a little bit, weren't you?
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly. So we always had to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in order to get to and from Selma back to our hometown. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've lived here in Wisconsin for quite some time.
I have. I've lived here since the age of 10, which is approximately 1964. I've been in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is we can get a perspective from the difference in the perspective of the two of you. You stayed in Alabama until you returned from the service.
Right.
And then you returned to Alabama, but then you kind of moved around and ended up in Wisconsin.
Yeah. I was with a newspaper soon after getting out of the service. I'm a photographer by trade, and I was hired by this newspaper called the Southern Courier.
Right, I've heard of that.
And that particular newspaper kind of covered the whole civil rights movement during that era.
Mm-hmm.
It had a grant from the Ford Foundation, and was used. That grant was used to kind of create a history of what was going on post Dr. Martin Luther King. No.
What I'm interested in your perspective is what the difference was between racial relations in the South and what it was in the North when you came here. Was there much of a difference?
Sure, certainly. In the South, when I was there, we had segregation, basically. We had no integrated schools or anything of that sort. I went to a public school, but it was a segregated school, and I can recall walking approximately 2.5 to 3 miles to get to the paved area. So we had 2 sets of shoes to walk on the muddied, unpaved walk to get to the paved area, and we would get there, and then we'd kick off our shoes into the briar bush, and then we put on our other shoes that we could then walk on the pavement. But what struck me was that when we got to that area, we would see white kids already on the bus, and we would then not have a bus to take us from even the paved area on to school. We would then walk yet another mile in order to get to school. And so those are the things that struck me as being different and odd. And of course, it wasn't until I arrived in Racine in 1964, approximately January of that year, that I first entered a classroom with a diverse background, Hispanics, whites, and blacks at that particular time.
You had the whole menu there, huh?
Yes, the whole menu.
Now, you experienced a real transition when you went into the military. The South was segregated, and when you came back out,
it was integrated.
It was integrated, yeah.
And that was a shock.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people ask me, say, how could you live in a segregated South like that, And
well, it's not like you have a choice, right?
No, it wasn't a choice, but you just kind of condition yourself to it. We used to go downtown, and as a black man, we couldn't wear shades. We couldn't actually look at white adults in the face, so I feel good sitting here tonight being able to look at you. And if young white girls were walking down the main street, we would actually have to step to the side and turn our backs to them. You know? So that would be considered very odd now, but that was just something we accepted. If you remember Emmett Till, he was supposedly whistling at a white girl. So, I mean, you could actually lose your life if you did those things at that particular time in my hometown.
And you learn that at an early age, as Ken has mentioned, not being able to look directly at, especially a white female. Those were things that you were told and taught as a child, that when you do go into town or encounter that situation, is that you don't look at them. Certainly do not stare at them, and that's just something that every kid were taught, whether it was male or female. Those are things that you were taught. I was raised to say yes sir and no sir to my parents. That was something that was instilled and ingrained in all of us. You do that to elders, and I can recall my parents saying yes sir and no sir to young white males and females, and it just struck me as being odd, because we were raised to say that in honor and reverence and respect to
adults,
elderly, and they were saying it to younger. And I remember asking my mother why, because the two just didn't correlate, and I never got a response to that, because I'm sure she had none at that time. So just some of the things that adults even encountered, and some of the disrespect and reverence that older adults had to pay to young white.
Well, let me ask you something. Did you have friendships with white kids down in Alabama, or?
No, I had no friendship. I had no interaction really, because I was in a segregated school.
What about when you came up here, and when you were amongst white kids? I mean, did you actually form friendships, or were you just like kind of thrown together? Because my experience, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, it seems as though the South has acclimated better to integration than the North has in some ways.
Definitely.
And I suspect that it's because even though there was segregation, there was interaction down South. Whereas up North, we've got integration, but not a lot of interaction.
Yes.
Now, was that your experience when you came up here, that you didn't really interact much with white
people?
Well, I mean, we'd be among each other.
Yeah, I can say for myself, because, mind you, as I mentioned, I was in an integrated environment, a segregated environment prior to coming here. So the whole thing of interacting with non-minorities was new to me, and so it didn't happen rapidly.
Yeah.
So to your question, no, there wasn't a whole lot of interaction because I had to yet understand how to navigate and assimilate in order to be able to fit in and to then engage with none. Your question, no, there wasn't a great deal of interaction outside of the classroom. Yet to the neighborhood, there were some mixture, diversity in the neighborhood, but not a lot.
Yeah.
You know.
And for me, it was really different because I got involved in the civil rights movement in like 62, 63. And we had the Freedom Riders and et cetera from the North, which when they came, we became a part of that movement. However, we had to, I remember a couple of demonstrations, and one of them, myself and I had a friend named Ken Hawkins, and we would go to all the marches, all the activities, but then we had to walk home. And I remember the police pulled up beside us,
cruising by.
And they said, "Aren't you those two boys that was singing, 'I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around'?" And they had their billy clubs, and and here we are, and now we had to say, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," you know. But when we was in the movement, and that was hard.
You felt empowered,
Yeah, we felt empowered. You wasn't scared, but then when the movement was over, you had to walk home. They would have these dogs, and police dogs, and they would be like jumping at us. And I remember they used to have the leash, and when the dog was really pulling, they would turn it loose, and the dog would jump right out in front of you, scare you to death, you know. So what we started doing, and we had like a training program, we started carrying black pepper.
Well, that was just during the demonstrations, though, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't like for the walk home, right?
No, but during the demonstration, we'd have the black pepper, and when the dogs would lunge at us, we'd throw the black pepper on them, and they'd turn around and go after their handle. You know? So we had all kind of little things that we did in the movement that we was actually trained to do. We used to take newspaper and wet it and wrap ourselves up.
Yeah.
And if the police would hit you with a billy club, they had a tendency to hit you around your waist and in this area and wouldn't hurt as bad.
Yeah, it would disperse some of the force,
And the other thing in training, we was trained to always protect our women. And so if the police would come after us, the women would lay down and we'd lay down on top of them to protect them from the
You sure you were just protecting them? You're talking about laying down on them.
That was a fun exercise.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, a lot of people don't acknowledge, but that actually was terrorism that was going on.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no other way to explain it. And it's sometimes we tend to think that terrorism was invented by Middle Easterners who came over here and knocked out the Twin Towers. But terrorism has been around for a long time. And it's been a part of the American culture for a long time.
Yeah, we was talking about that also recently. One of the things is that the system, to a great degree, and I'm not a police basher by no means, but it takes a certain amount of intimidation in police mind to control people. And that's when intimidation was used in the civil rights movement as a control mechanism to actually, scare you and make you not want to be a part of the movement because it was quite dangerous.
I think it's interesting. It's an interesting perspective to look at it as terrorism. I would tend to agree. I think too, to expound on that, you could look at the individuals as they migrated from the south to the northern cities and areas as refugees to get away from some of the the brutality, the dogs, and the squirting of the hoses and things like that. And so they migrated, if you will, to the north to be able to find better conditions and treatment for themselves and their families. So in some ways, you could equate that to being a refugee, yet in your own country.
Right. Well, you know, a lot of that migration, too, was done by recruitment. I know for a fact that Bell City Steel, which later became Racine Steel Castings, actively went to the south, specifically to recruit blacks to come and work in the foundry. And of course, they were given the nastiest jobs, but they were still good-paying jobs.
There weren't any clean jobs.
Well, that's true. Yeah,
I think Ken mentioned that these young people, civil rights leaders and others, were fearless, and I think we can attribute that to all of them, even when there were no dogs sicked on them or hoses turned on. Just the fact of the issues and insurmountable kinds of things that they were encountering and had to deal with, and just the courage to be able to take on that. I think if you look at the Selma to Montgomery march, for example, if my memory serves me correct, it was not the first time they attempted to do the march from Selma to Montgomery. The first time, I believe Dr. King called it off because he thought it would just be
too brutal.
Yeah. And then there were a couple of other attempts, and then ultimately it happened. It takes a lot of courage and foresight and just determination to be able to do that. And I'm appreciative and thankful for that kind of service and that kind of commitment and dedication today.
Oh, yeah. Well, these people that came down from Harvard, I assume they were pretty young, were they?
They was young.
Yeah.
And they the one had applied for the grant from the Ford Foundation. And I think that's what swayed me to want to get into news photography. You know, I've been taking pictures of my friends and portraits and stuff like that. But after my experience with the Southern Courier, that's when I finally moved to Milwaukee to work for the Milwaukee Courier.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought me in as the chief photographer.
Now, what year was that?
That was like 69.
60. How do you think the civil rights movement has progressed? I mean, do you feel like it's made serious progress, or have we like hit a high water mark and then receded, and now it's like another push for it? Or
there is some concern in that regard. I think as we look at progress, for example, I think some of our laws and things like that are not as is not as racist, for example, but the racism, I think, exists within an individual. I mean, we can eradicate racism or attempt to do it from our institutions, from our laws and things like that, but we can't necessarily eradicate it from someone's heart. And I think it appears to be more of that resurfacing now, or maybe not resurfacing, but because of the leadership that's coming out of Washington, perhaps it's emboldening and empowering individuals to be able to express their heartfelt racism, and that's concerning and alarming to me.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is economic.
I think some things have gotten better, and yet in other ways it's gotten worse. I've read a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, and it talks about the mass incarceration of especially young black males, and now moving into the realm of young females as well. And as you know, Wisconsin's incarceration rate is one of the highest in the country.
No. It's the highest.
It's the highest.
Yeah, the south, in particular the southwest corner here, Racine, Milwaukee, the highest in the country. And what I like to remind people is that due to the fact that the United States has more of its citizens and a greater percentage of its citizens incarcerated than any other country on the planet.
Yeah, I think black people are like 5% of the population and 25% of the prison population, something to that effect. And so when you look at those things, you have to say we haven't moved the needle a whole lot, because it's just a different form of racism that is occurring in today's society. And then we fast forward to Racine's ranking as the 4th worst city in the country.
Right.
Not in Wisconsin, but the 4th worst city in the country. And you look at the economic disparities of minorities making a third of what a white household would make. Those are the kinds of things. And then, of course, we can go into the educational disparities and things like that. Those things indicate that we have a whole lot more and a whole lot further to go before we get to the equality that I think and the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King has talked about, and the thing that we celebrate each and every year, talking about the dream and hopefully living the dream someday.
Yeah, and that's, what is it now, 50 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, to kind of piggyback, is the fact that it's something said, I can't quote it, but if a person loses their thought about history, repeated. And I think we went on a long vacation. When I said that, I'm talking about primarily African Americans, because right after the assassination of King, this country pretty much put him on a pedestal. We thought we had arrived and everything was going to be okay. We was getting new jobs. I remember my first wife, they hired her to replace another black woman that had a lighter complexion. So many of the places where, like banks and etc., you would they would have blacks working, they were picking dark-skinned blacks, and that was a big surprise because growing up, a black of a lighter complexion was always hired by most of these companies that if there's going to be visible to the public.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but even within the black community, light-skinned individuals were looked on with a little bit of favor. Is that not true?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was telling Donnie, we was talking, is that one of the things that I've realized as I kind of dissect what is going on now is the fact that during the movement, it was young people.
Yeah.
And I see a resurgence of that now. Young people are saying we are not being treated fair. We are going to jail. We are being incarcerated. We got to get up. We got to begin speaking out. And as you know, all over the nation, even right here in Racine now, young people are speaking out about things that they feel is happening to them.
Well, that's encouraging because, I mean, for a long time it's been like, well, let's find the young person that replicates a Martin Luther King speech the best once a year, and that's the young person to be proud of. But really the young people that are out in the streets doing the work, they're the ones to be the proudest of, in my estimation, because that's the only way things are going to happen, you know? So much for me. You know, I kind of hesitate to bring it up, but I think it's something that we need to talk about, and it's something that you and I talked about the other day at lunch, and that was something that happened when you were a young kid. And remember how you told me you were like looking through the blinds of the house?
Right. Would
you feel comfortable relating that story right now?
Well, what happened was I was in my bedroom, which was next to the street, and this young guy was he hauled corn whiskey, black guy, bootlegger, yeah. And the police had stopped him, and in Montgomery, you could tell the police because they always had their brights on, So you see them coming down the street, you would, get out of their way. They was quite intimidating in Montgomery. And they had stopped him. And they said, the N word, don't you know better than to be trying to sell corn whiskey around here? He was delivering the jugs of corn whiskey. He said, I'm going to let you go this time, but you get your out of here. And he said, run, and then used the N word again. And when the guy started running, he ran and he got ready to jump over this fence, and they shot him down. Yeah. Wow. And that kind of stuck in my mind. I was about 9 years old. So, that was, I was crying. My parents was trying to, but
it's a horrible thing for a kid to witness.
Yeah. And while I never witnessed any of that kind of racism and brutality, I've certainly heard of that through family members and others, that those kinds of things happen in the Deep South. Yeah. And of course, in the history books, we know it's evident, and we know that it occurred, we know that it happened. But I fortunately never encountered any of those kinds of actions.
Yeah, but now, you had in Montgomery, I think you mentioned a situation in Selma. You had, and you wouldn't believe that, you had black men that stood up against that system. And they was always characterized as, oh, leave so-and-so alone. He just a crazy N-word, But so, it's not that everybody, was just give in to it. You had people that would really just stand up against the system. And I noticed as the movement began, young people was just coming out in droves. We had a march.
Yeah.
We had what we call the underground, communication system, and they would.
That was before Facebook too, right?
Right. And
what was the technology like back then? I mean, would somebody run from house to house, or how did you carry the word around?
The church played a big role.
Okay.
We had in '54. We had. That's when Dr. King became prominent in Montgomery, leading the bus boycott. And the churches, they would put the information out there in church, and church have always been the refuge for black folks, because when you was downhearted and felt bad, you went to church on Sunday to be uplifted. But the church played a huge role. They would get these station wagons, because the bus, they didn't want the maids and et cetera that were going to the houses, and that's who was using the bus a lot in Montgomery.
Oh, you're going to talk about the bus boycott?
Yeah,
okay.
Right quick. But they used, the churches bought station wagons. Yeah. And the deacons and the church members would volunteer to take people to work. And that's what made the bus boycott successful.
Yeah.
Taxi cabs, we had like 3 taxi cabs in Montgomery, different companies. And they started doing it free. And the system, brought what they call justice on them and made them stop. And that's when the churches got the station wagons.
Yeah.
So.
Well, how do you feel about what's coming up? I mean, I'd like to close this out on a kind of an upbeat note, and I don't know exactly how to do that. Are you optimistic about how things are shaping up? Are you looking forward to things getting better?
Personally, I always try to keep an optimistic view. I think that inherently Americans really do want better race relations, and I think sometimes it takes the kinds of things that are happening, the leadership that's coming out of Washington, the hate that's being espoused from there, to bring us closer together and realize that we're in this together, and that we really have to come together to really mount some kind of defense against what is happening, whether it be with DACA, the deportation, and things like that. I think all of those things will galvanize groups diverse groups of individuals to come together to address those issues. So from that aspect, I am optimistic that something will happen. Ken Lumpkin has mentioned that young people getting involved and really not selling for some of the injustices and some of the brutality that have occurred, not in our city but in other communities. I think all of those things are encouraging young people that are major and positive contributors to society. I think those are the kind of things that are going to help propel us forward as we address some of these things that the hate and the inequities that are coming out of Washington, and we don't even have to look that far. We can look to our state leadership and the governor and places like that.
Mentioned because at the end here, and I have no problem in doing that we want people to get out and vote. Both of us are running for office, and that's how you. And
you're both running for county board supervisor positions.
I'm running. I've been on for 20 years, and I'm running for re-election for another 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, there's 2-year terms. Every 2 years, we're up for re-election.
Yeah.
And mine is 14 years. I'm running for the 4th district, and I think it's important because many of the issue we talked about tonight.
Yeah.
If you put the right person in the position that knows what's going on around them, they can affect change. And that's the government have to be changed in order for us to change the condition that some of the people are living in.
No, absolutely. Well, it's been an interesting discussion. I appreciate you guys being here and taking part in this, and I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you, Donnie, for coming in.
Thank you.
Ken,
yes,
as always.
Okay.
So thanks for being with us, and please remember to get out and vote, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
School